All right, let's go over chapter 4 here. All right, so the point here is to move on from where we were before. We went over cells and all the chemistry that goes on in there, and now we're going to start moving into the human bio and actually do our first organ system, which is the integument. So, but first, to move from cells to those organ systems, you have to go over tissues. Okay, so what is a tissue? Well, a tissue really is a group of cells that are working together to accomplish some task, all right? So the standard definition here is tissues are specialized cell groups that are similar in structure, and they complement or support each other to perform a function. And the important thing to remember is that tissues don't just have one cell type in them, okay? So for example, muscle tissue is going to have blood vessels in there, and there's going to be nerves in there. So and when you're talking about a whole tissue, this is there's going to be complements in there, all right? But we have 4 types of tissue, okay? So 4 types of tissue that are generally performing a function together, okay? So these 4 basic types, and we are going to go through the first 2, the connective and epithelial, in a lot more detail here. So connective tissue and epithelial tissue. And then as well, we're going to just introduce muscle tissue and nervous tissue, and you're going to have chapters on both of those, okay? Okay. So first of all, epithelial tissue and what makes that special. Well, epithelial tissue, if you think of it, the one thing that keeps them all in common is that they are made up of sheets of cells, okay? They're sheets of cells, and they're going to be supported by a basement membrane, which we're going to talk about, all right? These sheets of cells cover surfaces, line hollows, and ducts. In general, they have a very poor or lack of blood supply, all right? And I'll explain to you how these cells get around that problem shortly. The other thing is for epithelial tissue, think of it as separating in from out, okay? And with that, they reduce friction, so reduce friction, and they offer protection, right? Those are 2 general functions of these epithelial tissues. And here you can see in this slide that there are different styles, and we're going to talk about that. But you can see in each case, they are forming a tube or forming a lining of these tissues, right? So the respiratory tract, esophagus, intestine, the tubes in the kidney, and of course in the lungs, all right? And there's more, of course. Now, these arrangements, there are sort of rules and guidelines to how we look at these arrangements. And it's basically, the first rule is the shape of the cell. So you have to look at the shape of the cell and what it has, and there's going to be a name for that. And then there's going to be a name for the number of layers that the epithelial tissue is composed of, right? So when you're naming an epithelial tissue, there will be 2 names that go with it to describe that, all right? So when we come to the arrangement of the layers, we say it's a simple epithelium if there's only 1 layer, okay? And you can see that over here. And of course, what if there's multiple layers? Well, that's over here. It's called stratified, all right? So stratified, there are strata of cells here. Then we have this thing called pseudostratified, and pseudo always means that it looks like something or it behaves like something that it actually isn't. So in this case, it's pseudostratified. So it looks like there's more than 1 layer, but really there is only 1 layer. And the reason it has that appearance is because if you see the nuclei of these cells, they are not in a line. They are in different heights in the cells here. And you can see the cells don't have a beautiful standard shape either, but it is considered 1 layer, and it just looks like it's stratified, so it's pseudostratified. Now the next idea is the cell shape, and you have 3 cell shapes you're working with. You're working with squamous. Squamous are very flat, irregularly shaped cells. We say cobblestone, so if you're in communities where we have those old streets, And I know they have them in certain parts of Syracuse, for example, and definitely in New York City. They are cobbles. Okay, I used to walk on those when I was living in New York. Now, the other one is cuboidal, so they look like cubes, right? That is pretty straightforward. And then the other one is columnar, so they look like columns. So they're tall and taller than they are wide, and cubes, you know, same width and height and length, okay? All right, so those are our different things. And you need to be able to identify these. If I show you what epithelium, you should be able to determine what classification it is, okay? Now, as I mentioned before, epithelial cells are always supported by what's called the basement membrane. And what should you think about in terms of the basement membrane? Well, it's a network of very dense protein fibers, okay? They're very specific in what they include, all right? You can see here that there's different layers to that. I'm not going to get you to learn these terms. I just want you to understand that the basement membrane is actually a structure, and it's got 2 layers to it, and it is supported by more connective tissue, more proteins in connective tissue, which is another tissue type, which we'll talk about shortly, underneath. Okay, so you can already see that what I'm going to be getting to later is that all epithelial tissues are supported by connective tissues, all right? But in between the two, there is a basement membrane, which is a network of protein fibers. And this network provides strength and support to that sheet of cells, all right? Let me just see, okay. And this, when we say it's supported, we consider this the bottom of the epithelium, okay? Understand that epithelium in your body might not be up and down the way you think of up and down, but it's always at the base of the epithelium, and the other side is going to have the lumen, or the space, or the outside, and we'll talk about that shortly. Now, there are certain types of epithelia that produce substances, okay? Now, if these substances or secretions go to the outside, or outside the body, or into a tube of some kind, we say that those secretions are exocrine secretions, all right? And an example here is one that we'll see a lot. Here's an epithelium, and scattered in amongst these epithelial cells, or special epithelial cells called goblet cells, and their job is to secrete mucus, all right? And there's other things that we will secrete other than mucus. There's going to be oils, say out to the skin, saliva, sweat, milk, and some enzymes are going to be secreted out into spaces or lumens, or outside, or what's considered outside, all right? Now, sometimes these secretions are not going to go outside, they're going to go into the blood, in which case these secretory cells are called endocrine, all right? So first, exocrine are when the secretions are going outside, and endocrine when they're going to the blood, all right? And very often when we're talking about endocrine secretions, we are talking about hormones, all right? So endocrine to the blood, and exocrine to the outside, to lumens or spaces, okay? All right, so exo means outside of, and endo means within, all right, to help you remember that. Now, in order for these structures to take place, now understand that there's some cells, just single cells, that produce these secretions, and they go out, or exo, or into the blood, endo. But there's also glands, all right? So these are specialized structures in an epithelium, all right? And it starts off with our epithelial layer on its connective tissue, but you'll see that these cells will form these little clusters. And eventually these little clusters will develop to the point where there would be a little gathering. So there'd be a gland here, and there could be a tube that goes to the outside. So that would be an exocrine gland, all right? And then you can have a situation where the way development goes is that these are actually going to end up being cut off from the original epithelium and form a cluster around a blood vessel. In that case, we then have our endocrine gland, all right? And we will come across this. We'd have a whole chapter on endocrine secretions and hormones and all of that, all right? So we'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit more about this one here in this chapter when we talk about the integument. Now, these secretions. So if you have a secretory epithelium, we have sort of 4 categories that they go by depending on what is being secreted, all right? So the first one would be a mucous membrane, and in that you're going to have our favorite goblet cells, all right? These mucous membranes, they occur a lot, and as you'll see as we go through the course. So in the digestive system, the respiratory system, and the reproductive system, all are mucous membranes, all right, the linings there. Then we have serous membranes, and these are the ones you won't encounter too often, but I'm going to introduce them in this chapter, all right? So these are not producing mucus, but they're producing a very watery fluid, and it's actually a double membrane system, as I'll get to shortly. But these serous membranes in general, what they're covering are organs and body cavities. They're lining the body cavities. And they are producing a very liquidy secretion, and it's largely to reduce friction, all right? And I'll go over these, but we have the pericardium, which will be around the heart, the pleural, right, which are going to be around the lungs, and then the peritoneum, which is going to be in the abdomen. So we'll go over that in the picture. Then we have synovial membranes, which we'll talk about very shortly, not in this chapter, but it's coming up. And these are the ones that are around your synovial joints or your fluid-filled joints. So they're producing synovial fluid, all right? And then, of course, the other one that we will talk about in chapter 4, which is the cutaneous membrane, your integument, your skin, all right? So we're going to go over that shortly. And what sort of fluids are being produced there? Well, sweat and oils, all right? All right. So here are a bunch of examples of where these different types of epithelium reside, okay? And notice again that they each have a name. So simple squamous, lines, blood vessels, and air sacs. Simple cuboidal, these are going to be making tubes in the kidney, for example. Simple columnar, these actually have cilia on them, but they will be found in the digestive system, for example. Stratified columnar, you don't see this too often, but stratified columnar, you'll see this in the epidermis in the male system, mammary glands, and the larynx, all right? Stratified cuboidal, so this is going to line ducts of sweat glands, and stratified squamous, so that would be our skin, for example. You'll find it also in the mouth, vagina, right? So any place where you need protection, and we will go over that. So again, remember your exocrine glands, they're going to be formed structures of cells. They're still continuous with the epithelium, right? But they'll reside deep in the connective tissue below. And then we have our endocrine glands would actually end up being cut off from the outside. And they surround blood vessels so that they can put their secretions into the blood, right? So here are some actual pictures of these. So, because I wanted you to see what they actually look like. So here you can see that simple columnar in the digestive tract. And here you can see your stratified squamous. This is in the esophagus. And here you can see your simple squamous, all right? These are very permeable, all right, and around a blood vessel. And you can see there's many, many layers here in this stratified squamous, so that's protection. And this simple columnar here in the digestive tract is really good for secretion and absorption, all right? And we'll go over what's being secreted and what's being absorbed later in the course. Now, these sheets of cells have to be supported somehow. We've already gone over the fact that there is support from a basement membrane, but they're also supported between each other, okay, as well as there's ways of attaching those cells to that basement membrane, right? So you might have at one point gone over in great detail these types of connections, all right? But we're just going to mention for 105, you should at least understand these two concepts. So tight junctions and adhesion junctions. So these are the ones here in the orange box, all right? We'll get to this other one in a sec, which you're also responsible for, but I'm going to go over these first two first, all right? So these tight junctions, what they do is they form leak-proof seals, all right? And they're very special proteins that are involved with this, all right? Because some of these linings, you need to hold those fluids in and or separate them from the inside of the body, for example. So think of the digestive system here. The other ones are these adhesion junctions, all right? So these ones are going to anchor the cells together, or I'll anchor the cells to the basement membrane, all right? And there's two different types, and I mentioned them in my notes, all right? So we have the desmosomes, which are going to be between cells, and then the hemidesmosomes, there was a sort of one back here in a picture, which I kind of avoided talking about. Where did I put that? Where was that? Oh yeah, here, it says hemidesmosomes. This is where they're attaching the cell to the basement membrane, all right? So we have desmosomes and hemidesmosomes, and those are both types of adhesion junctions. Again, very specific proteins and very specific networks to the cytoskeleton, but just understand that we have tight junctions and adhesion junctions, and that the tight junctions provide leak-proof seals. And what do these adhesion junctions do? Well, they anchor the cells together or to the basement membrane, and they still allow flexibility of movement, right? So it wouldn't be good if your digestive epithelium was not flexible, for example, okay? Now, these are the types of junctions you'll find in epithelium. The other type of junction you won't normally find in an epithelium, okay? I can only think of one example where you might find this, and it would be a disease case, actually cancer. But these gap junctions, all right, these are found between cells of different tissues in general, and we will talk about them, but I want to introduce this junction here since we're talking about junctions, and that's why these are not in the orange box for epithelium. But gap junctions, they provide a channel between cells, and we're going to see this specifically when we talk about muscle. But you'll have these channels between the cells so that substances, ions, for example, can travel directly between cells. And there's a very specific function for this, and we will talk more about it later. All right. Okay, now, as I was alluding to, these epithelial tissues are attached to a basement membrane, and the other side is to the lumen, or to the outside. So you can already tell that there's a sidedness, we say, a sidedness to an epithelium. So there's the top and the bottom, or the outside and the inside, depending on how you want to look at it. Okay, so the side that's facing the outside, or to the lumen, is called the apical side. And sometimes you will find cilia or villi and microvilli on the apical side, specifically the microvilli on the cells. They'll form together villi, as we'll get to. But this, remember what we're doing here. I had mentioned this when we were talking earlier about the cell membrane, and this will increase the surface area here for exchange. So imagine this being the digestive system, and you're trying to absorb or secrete, okay? Now, on the other side, the side that's facing the basement membrane, that's called the basolateral side, all right? So the basement side, all right? And there's different proteins on different sides. Now, very often these epithelial cells will be will be involved in absorption and secretion. So we can think about the paths that substances can take to get from the outside to the inside, or from the lumen to the supporting tissue. So we can have a situation where substances will manage to get through between cells, and that's called paracellular. And then we have a situation where it's going across the cells, so that's transcellular, okay? So there's different ways of these things being transported, and very often proteins are involved. So we have our transport proteins, and now you know why we went over all of those in the first section of the course, right? So now these epithelia that have these two sides are called polarized, because there's two sides to them, all right? So when things are being absorbed, that's called absorption, and things that are being released, that's called secretion, all right? Okay, next idea. Now, I had already alluded to this. Remember, epithelial cells, they're mostly coverings, right? But something that they don't have very much of are blood vessels. Okay, so epithelial cells in general, they're very cellular. You can see there's lots and lots of cells all packed together and they're hanging onto each other. There's very few protein fibers until we get to that basement membrane. And there's very few, if any, blood vessels. So how are these cells being nourished? Well, every epithelial tissue is supported by a connective tissue, as we've already sort of talked about, because I said there's the basement membrane, and below that is your connective tissue. Now, the connective tissue, there's many different types, but those connective tissues that support epithelium in general have very few cells, okay? But what they do have are blood vessels, all right? So those blood vessels are going to help nourish those epithelial cells. And in contrast, there's going to be many supporting fibers that we have here, different types of fibers. So collagen, fibronectin, for example, are going to be in the connective tissue supporting the epithelium, all right? Now, those epithelia that are being supported by connective tissue, all right, very often the connective tissue supporting it is what we call loose, okay? So loose, it's very flexible, but it's not as strong. This is something I'm going to get into. So they're flexible, but not as strong. And you can see that these loose are, you can see the fibers. There's some cells here, they're called fibroblasts, they're making the fibers. And very often you're going to find them surrounding organs, all right? There's 3 types of loose connective tissue, which if you move on to A&P, you will learn the 3 types. But for the most part, what you're going to see in 105 is what we call loose, all right? So loose, or areolar. So loose areolar connective tissue is what you're going to see the most in terms of the loose connectives. So it's called areolar. And then if we have loose, well, we're going to have dense. Okay, so dense connective tissue. Again, there's 3 types of that, but the most common, and what we'll see the most in this course, is the dense regular connective tissue. And you can see what it looks like. It looks like these fibers are all lined up. There's not very many cells. There's a few here, but the protein fibers are regular, right? They look like strands, and you can see that. These are very strong, right? But they're not as flexible. So here, what you're thinking of are tendons and ligaments. So we will see those, all right? Now, this next idea is what gets a lot of students confused, right? So we have connective tissues, loose and dense, and these are like loose, there's very often supporting those epithelial tissues. The most common one is the areolar, right? Flexible, but not as strong. Dense, we have 3 types, but we talk about regular in 105, strong, but not as flexible. But there are specialized connective tissues, all right? And I'm going to go over them very briefly here, okay? So there's a series of specialized connective tissues that I know you're familiar with, but you need to understand that they are each a type of connective tissue. They don't look at all like loose or dense, okay? So the first one is cartilage, okay? Now, when we're talking about cartilage, the cells that are producing the cartilage are called chondrocytes, okay? So chondrocytes. Now, you're going to need to learn these terms, chondrocytes, right? Now, again, we have 3 types of cartilage, and I will go over them. Hyaline is the one that's shown here. It is the most common, right? It's going to be found on the ends of bones and in joints, all right? So this is what we're going to talk about later. Now, the thing about cartilage connective tissue is that it doesn't have a lot of blood vessels, so it's very slow to heal, okay? So if you damage your cartilage, it takes a while to heal in some way, and it won't heal back to how it was before, all right? But it is flexible and it's strong, all right? Now, the next one, again, this is a type of connective tissue, bone, all right? What produces bone? Osteocytes, or that's what maintains the bone, all right? So the cells in the bone are called osteocytes, okay? Now, here again, the cells that are in the cartilage are called chondrocytes. All right, I sort of misspoke. I said it produces the cartilage. Those cells actually maintain the cartilage. All right, so we'll get into more detail later. Okay, so the cells that you're going to find in your cartilage are chondrocytes. All right, and they maintain the cartilage. And likewise, the cells that you find in your bone connective tissue are called osteocytes, and they maintain that bone. All right. Now, unlike cartilage, bone has a very good blood supply, so it heals, right? Now, the matrix, or the stuff surrounding those osteocytes, is mineralized and it's very strong, all right? Whereas with cartilage, it's flexible, right? It's not mineralized. They're very similar, and they look similar when you look at these pictures, all right? But they're different in terms of that matrix and the blood supply, all right? And we will talk more about this, all right? So again, the cells that maintain cartilage, okay, the maintain cartilage cells are called chondrocytes, and those cells that maintain bone are called osteocytes, okay? Now, and then in the matrix, we'll talk about this when we talk about bone, but one of the main minerals that we see here is obviously calcium, all right? All right, now, the next type of specialized connective tissue doesn't look a bit like the others, and it's blood, all right? There are many different types of cells in blood. Blood cells are produced in the bone marrow, which we will talk about, all right? And each of those cells has a very specific function, right? So it's not like with cartilage and bone where we have a maintaining cell. Here, there's many different types of cells, and they each have a job to do, which we'll talk about later. Now, the matrix, or the stuff outside of the cells here, is called plasma, all right? And it's fluid, right? So here in cartilage, we had a flexible matrix. With bone, we had a matrix that was mineralized and strong. And here, with blood, we have a matrix that's fluid, okay, called plasma. Now, the next idea, or the next specialized connective tissue, is adipose, which is fat, right? It's also considered a type of loose connective tissue. Remember I said there's 3 types when I mentioned areolar. Well, adipose is another type of loose connective tissue, but we also consider it a specialized connective tissue, all right? The cells here are called adipocytes, all right? And their job is to store lipid. And what does adipose do for us? Well, it provides us with insulation, protection, and obviously it stores energy, all right? I'm going to mention this later in the course when we talk about nutrition and eating disorders. But when you're born, you are born with your complement of adipocytes, and they either expand and shrink depending on how much fat they're storing. And once they expand, it's really difficult to get them to, get back to their normal size. Now, there are some individuals that start to make more adipocytes in their life, and scientists are trying to understand why that happens, right? But in the normal case, you have your complement of adipocytes in your adipose connective tissue, and they expand or they shrink. Okay, now we've finished our epithelial tissue, we've finished our connective tissue. Now we're going to introduce the other 2 types, and like I said, you'll have a whole chapter on both of these later. Okay, so the first type is muscular tissue. Now, what are the cells called here? They are called myofibers, okay, or muscle cells, but myofibers is the term that we use. And we're working in 3s. So again, there's 3 types of muscular tissue, and we're going to go over these in great detail, all right? So we have here our skeletal muscle, and I'm going to go over a chart with you here in the next slide to go over the features. The second type is cardiac muscle, and the third type is smooth muscle. So skeletal muscle, where do you find that? Obviously, your skeleton. Cardiac muscle, where do you find that? Well, your heart. And smooth muscle is found in different places around the body, having particular functions, and we will go over that in a sec here, okay? So they have very different properties. Okay, one thing that they all have in common is that they are contractile. They will contract and they will recoil, so they are elastic. All right, but that's pretty much where the similarity ends. All right, now you need to start to learn the concepts introduced in this chart. All right, so the first one we already went over. Where do we find skeletal muscle? Skeleton. Where do you find cardiac muscle? Heart. Where do you find smooth muscle? And understand that sometimes, and I'm going to throw this out here, this muscle is called visceral. And the reason it's called that is because you find it in the GI tract. But you will also find it in the uterus and places like that, the eye, around the blood vessels. So this smooth muscle is the muscle that exists everywhere else besides the heart and the skeleton, all right? It has a lot of very specific functions. So now when you look at functions, skeletal muscle movement, produce heat when you shiver, posture, cardiac muscle, well, pumping blood, visceral or smooth muscle, well, lots of stuff, peristalsis, blood pressure maintenance, size of your pupils, cause your hairs to stand on end, right? How do these look? Well, they look, skeletal muscle is striated. It has lines on it. We're going to go over what these lines are when we do muscle. They have more than one nucleus, these skeletal muscles. These skeletal muscle fibers are very long cells. Some of them are as long as from your hip to your knee, right? So as long as your muscle is, that is as long as your skeletal muscle fibers must be. Cardiac muscle is also striated, but the cells are much smaller. There's one nucleus. And visceral or smooth muscle, there are no striations. You won't see those lines. And there's one central nucleus. Now, importantly, do you control these muscles? Well, skeletal muscle, yes, it's voluntary because you can control it. But the other two, cardiac and visceral, are involuntary. You don't control those, all right? You can't tell your heart to beat, all right? That is done without your conscious thought. The same thing with your viscera. You don't tell your gut to contract to move your food along your digestive tract. That is done without your conscious thought, all right? And the last type of tissue is nervous tissue. And again, what should you know right now? Well, that there's this is what are generating and transmitting electrical impulses in your body. The nervous tissue is made up of two sort of classes of cells, the neurons themselves that do that work, but they're supported by a network of cells called glial cells, and there's many different types, okay? Now, when we're talking about the neurons, the three parts of the cell that you need to be familiar with is, first of all, the cell body, where the nucleus is. Then there's the dendrites that collect the information and send it into the cell itself. And then the axon, which moves the information off to the next location, whether it's another neuron or a gland or what have you, okay? Now, these tissues then combine to make organs, all right? And these organs are found in organ systems. So, you know, an organ has many types of tissues within it, typically all four types of tissues, all right? And that organ is doing a function. And then an organ system is a group of organs that are working together for a common function. And we have 11 organ systems in the body, all right? And we will go through each one, all right? We're going to start with one in this chapter, as you know. Now, before we get into that, we have a little bit of housekeeping to do, and that is to go over our body cavities. We have three main cavities, all right? So they're outlined here in yellow, blue, and green, all right? You need to learn these, all right? So in the yellow, this is the one that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. So with that, we have the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity, and we will talk about them later, all right? So the cranial cavity formed by the cranial bones contains the brain. The vertebral canal or cavity is the one that's formed by the vertebral column, and in there you have your spinal cord. Then your thoracic cavity was kind of complicated because it has several cavities inside of it. So first of all, you have two pleural cavities. These are going to be surrounded by a serous membrane. Those two pleural cavities surround the lungs. And then the pericardial cavity, again, you're going to have that serous membrane there producing fluid, surrounds the heart. And then we have a central region called the mediastinum. This is not, does not have a serous membrane around it. It's basically a cavity, a space. And in that contains basically your esophagus and some, it also includes the pericardial cavity, all right? And we'll go over that in a sec. And then we have our abdominal pelvic cavity, which is a large cavity below the diaphragm, all right? And in there, you're gonna have your abdominal cavity, all right? So you can see what it has in it: stomach, spleen, liver, that kind of thing. And then the pelvic cavity, so that's sitting right down in your pelvis. It's all contained within the same serous membrane, all right? So the peritoneum, all right? Now, that thoracic cavity, just another quick look at that. So in that thoracic cavity, we have the two pleural cavities, and we also have the pericardial cavity as well as the mediastinum, okay? Now, here I like this diagram because you can see the serous membranes involved here. Remember I said that serous membranes is sort of a membrane that's folded on itself. You can sort of think of it, and it's surrounding an organ. So here we've got the pleural one surrounding the lungs and the pericardium around the heart. But think of it this way. So if you took sort of a soft balloon and you punched your hand into it, you would have a layer around your hand, okay? And that would be the inner part of that serous membrane. And then you'd have the outer part of the balloon, okay? And that's going to be the outer part of that membrane, okay? And so it's sort of like a double membrane, even though that they are connected. And the part that's touching your hand would be called the visceral layer of that membrane. And the outer part that's not touching your hand, and in between is that air space, would be the parietal layer. Now understand that in the serous membrane, there wouldn't be air between those two layers. It would be your watery fluid, okay? And you have another one of these, again, like I said, in your abdomen. It's called the peritoneal membrane, or peritoneum, okay? And we'll talk more about them later. Now, the other thing you need to learn are some anatomical directions for this course, all right? So the directions, first of all, superior, closer to the head or upper part of a structure; inferior, farther down towards the feet or the lower part of a structure. And then the other one is distal, something that's further away from the trunk of the body, and proximal, something that's nearer to the trunk. And then we have our three planes. Again, we're working in threes. So the one plane is called the frontal plane. That's going to separate front from back, all right? The transverse plane is separating up from down. And then we have our sagittal plane that's separating right and left parts of the body. And the mid-sagittal plane is right down the middle, all right? So understand that there's going to be many mid-sagittal planes, many sagittal planes, only one mid-sagittal plane. That's only right down the middle, but sagittal planes is anything that's separating the body in that direction. So you just have to learn those, all right? Now, in order to get into the next part of the course, we have to do a little bit remind us about homeostasis before we get into our organ systems. So remember what I had said at the beginning of the class, the course, that the body is trying to maintain balance, all right? And that balance is called homeostasis, all right? So it's not equilibrium again, remember. It's homeostasis, so that's a balance within the body. So the body, when it's healthy, exists in a certain range of concentrations or temperatures or pHs that allow the system to work, all right? Now, if you're a single-celled organism, and again, we have many, many of those, all right? The maintenance of homeostasis is direct, all right? That those cells have to directly deal with their environment. But we are multicellular, and therefore the maintenance of homeostasis is a participatory type of situation where cells work together around the body to do this, all right? But suffice to say, if the homeostasis is changed somehow, so due to something on the outside or on the inside, there's going to be a change or a loss of homeostasis, and the organism is going to attempt to fix that, all right? And if it works, the organism will remain well, and if it fails, we get illness or disease, all right? Now, the reason, even though we are multicellular and we have the integument, which we'll talk about on the outside of us, we are still an open system. We take in things, right? We take in things through our lungs, our skin, our intestine. And then we give off things, okay? We give off waste, all right? And we have to get rid of that, right? So it's lost through the kidney, the liver, the lungs, and the skin as well, all right? So even though we are this sort of system contained in a bag that's called our skin, we are an open system, and so we're open to the outside. So we really have to have a system of checks and balances to maintain our homeostasis. And this is done by these things called control systems. So control system, it takes in information. So we call that an input signal. That information is processed, okay, and that's integrated. Very often the integrating system is the brain, but not all the time. And we'll go over when it's, like a few examples when it's not, all right, when we get further on in the course. And then the system has to respond. And in order to respond, there has to be a signal that goes out to mediate that response. So that's your output signal, and finally your response. So these control systems have in them each of these parts. And you will see diagrams like this, again, when we go into hormones, all right? But right now, let's talk about the different ways that the body maintains its homeostasis. So the first one is the most common system in the body, and that is negative feedback. Okay, so what happens here is that just like you have here a temperature gauge on a fish tank, okay, the temperature gauge might be set to 30 degrees centigrade, right? Your temperature gauge is set to 37 degrees centigrade, all right? But it will vary, all right? It will go a little bit down, and then the body will do something to warm it back up, and then just like the heat will go on, and then the heat on the fish tank thermometer heater will go on, and then it will stay on. It will go up a bit above 30, all right? And then it will go off, and then it will drop, all right? So this is what we consider a normal range, you know, between 29 and 31 degrees centigrade keeps your fish happy, right? If you go too far below 29, the fish aren't so happy, or too far above 31, the fish aren't so happy, okay? Now, similarly, you know, we have a system like this, right? If it's too low, right, something will happen. There's a sensor that's going to notice this. It's going to tell the control center, and the control center is going to send an information to an effector, and you're going to get back to where you're supposed to be. Same thing as if it's too high, the sensor will notice that, and it will bring you back to your set point, all right? So the most obvious one, and we already talked about this one, this would be your temperature control system, just like the fish tank, right? You exist in balance. So if the body temperature falls, your receptors, you've got specific receptors in the skin that are sensitive to cold, and we'll use those in the lab this semester. The control center is in part of the brain called the hypothalamus, sends information, say, to your skeletal muscles that cause you to shiver, and that will bring your temperature back up. Similarly, if the temperature is too high, okay, you've got heat-sensitive receptors in your skin. They will send information again to the hypothalamus, and then your sweat glands will respond by trying to lower your temperature by sweating, okay? So that's a classic negative feedback. But we also have situations where we have a building response, and that's called positive feedback. So we get more and more and more of an effect, and the only way to make it stop is to remove the stimulus entirely, all right? And it's like a runaway train, or when one sheep starts running, they all go, and they won't stop until that first sheep stops running. Okay, so this is the same idea. Now, within the body, we have some very specific examples of how we use this. Remember, most of the time we use negative feedback, but we have some positive. Okay, so the first one would be blood clotting. Now, that's common to both men and women. We both have a blood clotting effect here. And if you break your blood vessel, you're going to bleed until the crack is healed, okay? So, and that would be by a clot. So the clotting system is actually the positive feedback, right? So it sort of starts and it builds on itself until that crack is healed. So that stimulus is a break in the vessel. And clotting is going to continue until that has been healed, sealed over, all right? So that is positive feedback, so clotting. The other situations are sort of unique to the female system. So the first one is childbirth. So muscle contractions of the uterus will continue until the child is born, all right? So the muscle contraction of childbirth are positive feedback. And the other one is milk letdown when triggered by a suckling infant. So until the infant will start suckling, it will cause a positive feedback to release milk. And only when that child stops suckling will the milk release stop, okay? Now, the other one isn't really a feedback mechanism. This is just something called feed-forward regulation that has a role to play in the body, some very specific examples, and I mentioned them. So salivation at the sight or smell of food, right? So the body's anticipating a meal, so you'll start to salivate. And with that, your stomach will also increase acid levels, all right? So those are both sort of feed-forward regulations in anticipation of a change that's going to happen. The other one is the release of milk when a woman hears a baby cry. So if a woman is lactating, if a baby cries, she can release milk even if it's not her own baby. So it's kind of a weird situation, but it's the anticipation of an infant that's going to suckle. Another thing, if you train, right? If you're anticipating some physical activity, very often the heart rate will start to go up before you even start, all right? So those would be examples of feed forward, all right? And that's to anticipate what's going to happen. Now, we have a very short time to just go over our first organ system, and that's the integument. And it matches along with what we were just talking about with the epithelium, all right? So why do we have the integument or the skin? And you're gonna need to know these points. So first of all, it's gonna protect you from dehydration, protects you from injury, right? Defense from infection. This is why burn victims very often have infections because their integument is compromised. Regulation of temperature, right? That's where you have your sensors for temperature. Helps in the synthesis of vitamin D. And obviously sensation, very important for us. Touch, pain, temperature, vibration, all right? How does the skin do this, all right? Well, we've got 3 layers to the integument, all right? So the outermost layer is the epidermis, and here you've got lots of epithelial tissue, very few blood vessels, all right? Then, of course, since you have an epidermis, you have to have a connective tissue supporting that, and that is your dermis. So here you have connective tissue. You've also got nerves, and you've got glands, and this is where your hairs are residing, all right? And then underneath that, you have a layer of hypodermis, and this is, that's largely that connective tissue called adipose, all right? So we're gonna go over each of these, all right? So, but what is the point of having these multiple layers? Well, they each have a function in a role to play in skin function, all right? So the epidermis is going to resist the damage, is going to protect the underlying tissues. The dermis is going to be providing that temperature stability, and it's going to prevent you from dehydrating, all right? Limited healing, all right? And hypodermis, that's your insulation. And it's also going to allow that skin to be anchored in place. You don't want your skin to fall off, right? You have that there. Okay, so let's go through the different layers. So the epidermis, there's lots of different cells there, right? So here, if you look at it, you've got a stratified squamous situation. Your very bottom layer is the most alive layer, right? The outermost layer, you know that you can rub your hand over a surface and you're not going to destroy your skin. And that's because you have layers of dead cells up there. But your most alive cells are right at the bottom, right? And we call that your basal layer, right? It's attached to that basement membrane. And here you have your basal cells, and these are stem cells, and their responsibility is to produce the cells above, okay? So these basal cells are the stem cells, and what are the cells that they're producing, all right? They're producing the keratinocytes. So up here, you've got keratinocytes, and as their name suggests, they contain keratin, all right? And the other thing you're gonna find here at this basal layer, this basement layer, are melanocytes. And we're going to talk about what they're doing. They're producing melanin, right? Okay. Now, so if we go through each cell type, and I've got them at page 10 of my notes here. So basal cells, right? So basal cells, they are the stem cells. They divide. They produce immature keratinocytes. Then the keratinocytes, so let's move here, all right? Their job is to produce keratin. What is keratin? Well, I had mentioned it as a type of intermediate filament when we talked about the cytoskeleton, but it is a very strong protein. It's very protective. And the other thing that it gives the skin is some waterproofing ability, right? Now, as these keratinocytes mature, they produce more and more and more and more keratin. And actually, the act of basically flooding themselves with keratin actually kills them, right? And eventually they're dead, the nucleus disappears, and they are just bags of keratin at the top, all right? But before that, understand that there are living cells there that are producing that keratin, and they just fill themselves up. Now, the important thing to understand here is that as these basal cells divide, they push the other layers upwards, okay? So it's constantly renewing itself as the dividing cells push these cells upward. They get further and further from their blood supply, which is another reason these cells die, but they get more and more full of keratin as they move up, all right? Which is the second reason that they're dying, all right? And so that's how that system is working. So we've got the keratin, the keratinocytes. Now, the keratinocytes, they do have pigment. You know, your skin is, for most of us, a continuous color, all right? And that color is from the melanin that we're producing. And I'm going to talk about the shades of melanin in a sec. That melanin is produced by the melanocytes, which are pretty much mostly at the basal layer. Now, the reason that our skin color is maintained is because the keratinocytes take up that melanin. So the melanocytes produce so much melanin that's secreted out, and the keratinocytes eat it. So that's how that works. So they take up that melanin that's produced by the melanocytes. Now, the melanocytes, all right, we all have melanocytes, no matter what shade of color we are, all right? But what will vary is the type of melanin that we're producing, okay? So if you have a darker shade of skin, you produce more of what's called eumelanin, all right? And that eumelanin is blackish brownish, it's insoluble, and it functions as an antioxidant and a strong UV absorber, all right? So this is why if we think of evolutionarily, those individuals that come from where we have bright sun and they, it's hot, so they don't cover themselves up with layers of clothing, it makes sense that you're going to produce more of this UV absorbing eumelanin, right? Whereas those of us like me, whose ancestry comes from colder places where we cover ourselves up with layers and layers of clothing, we produce pheomelanin, right? It's sort of more of a yellow, reddish color, all right? And that isn't very good at UV absorption. It's actually an oxidant, and it's much more soluble, right? So they're different types of melanin, right? And we have 65 genes that are involved, and we'll talk about this later, but 65 genes that tell us what type of melanin we're producing and how much, and that's why we have such a kaleidoscope of colors to the human system, right? Now, the next type of cell is a phagocytic cell. We have to have something that protects us. Our skin is exposed to the outside. We can get infections, we get cuts. And our phagocytic cells that we have, so phagocytes, right, they take stuff in. They're immune cells. They're called Langerhans cells. So they're named after the scientists that discovered them. And then I had mentioned that we have a lot of sensation, right? We don't have a lot of nerves in the epithelium. We don't. But we have sensory cells called Merkel cells, and they're associated with a neuron that's found in the dermis. Okay, so we have our Merkel cells, they're sensory cells. Now the dermis, okay, here's another picture of the epidermis. So here you can see, I like this one because here you can see your Merkel cell, and it's actually also found at this basal layer here, okay? So here you have your melanocytes spreading out, spreading pigment. You can have your Langerhans cells wandering around in here, and then you have your layers and layers of dead cells. And these ones won't go too far, these Langerhans cells, because they do need to get nutrients, and then that comes from the blood supply, which is in the dermis. Okay, dermis. So here we have lots of interesting features, all right? So here we see these bumps, these dermal papillae that give us our fingerprints. Now, why do we have those? Well, those are it gives the dermis the ability to extend a little bit into the epithelium. There's blood vessels there to support the epidermal cells. We also have nerve endings there, right? They're associated with the Merkel cells. All right, and the blisters are going to form in this region, so when you get a blister. Now, another type of cell that another type of feature of the dermis are the protein fibers, right? So this you could sort of think of as your loose epithelium, loose connective tissue, and here you're going to also have protein fibers. Now, these fibers are produced by a particular cell type called fibroblasts. Okay, so try to remember that term. Fibroblasts produce protein fibers. What do? Well, they're providing strength and elasticity to your skin, all right? The next feature I mentioned before is your hairs, right? The hairs are located, there's stem cells at the root, at the hair follicle that produces the hair, and that is found in the dermis. The hair itself, of course, extends through the epidermis, okay? So what do you need to remember here? Well, first of all, you have your hair follicle where you have your root, okay? And that's producing your hair. And you also have a smooth muscle that's attached to that hair called the erector pili muscle, all right? It's attached to the hair follicle and it contracts when you're cold. That's why you get your goosebumps all around your hairs, because that muscle is going to contract. It's going to cause the hair to stand on end. And the reason you do this is so that you get a layer of warm air right up along the skin, and the hair sort of traps that layer of warm air to help warm you up, okay? Now, the next thing that you've got are glands, all right? So we have two types of glands in the skin, all right? So first of all, you have oil glands. So the oil glands, all right, here, they open to the hair follicle, all right? Why do we have these? Well, they prevent water loss, and the thick oil slows bacterial growth, right? So you're getting liquid on your skin, you're producing water, that's going to slow the bacterial growth. And then the other type of gland is sweat gland, right? So the sweat gland, it's called an exocrine sweat gland. If you look at this one opens to the outside, to a pore, all right? So that watery liquid that you have to help maintain your temperature is going to open right out to the surface of the skin. So remember, sweat glands open to the surface, oil glands open to the hair follicle, all right? Now, what else do you have in that sweat other than water? You also have antibiotic, right? So that's also going to help inhibit bacterial growth. So the water's going to help cool you. Remember, as that water evaporates, it pulls the energy out of your skin, the heat energy, so it cools you off. And then you also have, again, that antibiotic, which is going to be antibacterial. So the sebaceous gland, the oil gland, is being antibacterial because it's thick, it slows bacterial growth. And the exocrine, or sweat gland, produces an antibiotic, which is also going to be detrimental to bacteria. And then the last thing about skin and the dermis of the skin is that you've got lots and lots and lots of different types of nerves. You've got special nerves that detect pain. You have special ones that detect heat, cold, touch, tickle, vibration, everything. All right, so there's very specific nerves in the dermis that detect all these different sensations, because you know if you're being tickled or if you're being poked, all right? And you've got different nerves that tell your brain, I'm being poked versus tickled, all right? Now, the last thing is just talking about melanoma, because that is one of the cancers of the integument. And I've always had, because I used to work on melanoma, and I often have people ask me, is this mole bad? Well, here we have a little chart just to help you, the ABCDEs of melanoma. So if you look at a mole, if it looks asymmetrical, so it's not a nice shape to it, that would be one trigger. If there's no defined border, so that's borderless. If there's a color change, so it's multi-toned. If the diameter is bigger than 1/4 of an inch, that's kind of a warning sign. And if the moles are changing, Okay, that is also going to be a sign. So that's why if you go and get your moles checked out by a dermatologist, they take pictures of suspect spots so that they can compare it the next time you come in, right? Now, important thing to understand, all right, is that when your skin is hit with UV light, the melanocytes become more active and they produce more pigment. And the keratinocytes take in that pigment, all right? But normally those melanocytes don't start to divide. They just produce more pigment, all right? When they start to divide, that's when you're going to be going towards a cancer. So understand that when you're tanning, your melanocytes are not dividing. They're just producing more pigment. If they start dividing, you're going to be on your ways through the ABCDEs of melanoma, all right? So that's an important thing to understand. Why do melanocytes might start to divide and you start getting cancer? Well, if they're producing more melanin, they're more active, and that might trigger a dividing pathway in the body and get them to start kickstarting them and move them towards a cancer. So they're more subject to mutations, also because they're exposed to the UV light, right? Okay, so that's this chapter. Hopefully going over that, there's a lot of material in this chapter. It's kind of short. We do it in 2 days, but there's a lot of stuff going on here. All right, so thanks a lot.